Good morning and welcome to the Eastman Financial Report. I'm Dan Eastman, your host, and today is Friday, February 20th, 2026. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, we appreciate your viewership here at the Eastman Financial Report and throughout the day on all of the great programming you see on Worldview Tube and here at Worldview Radio. As you know, we are a Christian broadcasting network, and that's our ministry, our mission, our passion, and our goal to bring to that great marketplace of ideas the news and information of the day from a Christian perspective. That's what we do, and that's what we've been doing on the air since 2006. We're very happy to be in this space because, as you know, 2026 is going to be a very politically charged year with midterm elections and all of the things, the goings on at the budget and the federal government and the usual political. It's very important that our viewpoint remains strong and clear and consistent. And that's why we do this ministry on a daily basis. You can help us in this ministry by going to worldviewfoundation.com and making a donation. The web address is on the screen. You can go to www.foundation.com or worldviewfoundation.com. And you can use the QR code and it'll take your smartphone right to the web and you'll be able to make a donation. You can do a one-time donation, which helps always. We are very much appreciated. And of course, you can sign up for monthly donations, which has the added benefit of flattening our revenue curve a bit so we can better match our costs to revenues and keep our content free of charge. As you know, you're not paying a subscription or a paywall to watch our programming. Rather, it is freely given, and we do that because we are sustainable through our donations and our other efforts. And that's why donations make a great deal of difference, because we want to continue offering our content free of charge to the great marketplace of ideas. And just the way the apostles did it back 2,000 years ago, when they started offering the good news throughout the Middle East, they didn't charge admission. It wasn't an entertainment venue. It was a gift freely given. And we continue in that spirit today in this ministry. So if you'd like to help us continue this, making a donation at Worldview Foundation or www.foundation.com will really help. You can also help us by doing business with the vendors you see advertising throughout the day on our network. As you know, we don't sell blocks of advertising time to the highest bidder. Rather, we partner with companies that we know and trust. And when they offer goods and services on our network, you can rest assured that they've been vetted by us. And when you do business with them, a small portion of the proceeds comes back to us in the form of a commission. And that also helps us keep our ministry sustainable. That's very important. And we have some great vendors on this network. So please watch their advertisement and certainly do business with them. A third way you can help out is to subscribe to our product called The Vault. If you go to worldviewtube.com/vault, you can subscribe, and it's an annual or monthly basis, and it's a real treasure. It's what you put into a vault, is treasures and things that are important. But within that vault is Brandon Howe's ministry, and if you know, he's written 15 books, and he's had a lot of conferences, seminars, and events, and all of that has been digitized and captured in the vault. So if you are looking for spiritual enhancement or a little bit of an uplifting place to go on some of those days when we're down spiritually or emotionally, that's a really great product to have. It's a wonderful product for you to have in your toolbox. It's reasonably priced. So it's an on-demand product. So when you need a little extra spiritual lifting, certainly joining this community of believers in the vault is a wonderful thing to have at your fingertips. And keep in mind, we all know people who are struggling in life because life is complicated. And what a wonderful gift to give to somebody as well. If they're struggling with their faith or family issues or health issues or financial issues, you know, it's nice to have a gift from somebody that you can log into on demand 24/7 and see some very great uplifting and spiritually enhancing programming. And it's a wonderful thing. So that's how you can help us in this ministry. You can make a donation, always appreciated. You can do business with the vendors you see advertising on our network. And of course, you can subscribe to the Vault. And that will give you quite a package to keep us continuing to broadcast in this space throughout the year and keeping the content free of charge, the great marketplace of ideas. Well, let's go to the news today. And I was going to talk, I've been talking this week about data centers, and today I wanted to talk about water issues. But there's breaking news, and I want to talk about this breaking news because it's very important. As you know, President Trump, when he was elected, has been using the tools of the presidency in negotiating with foreign countries. And that's one of the powers that the President of the United States has under our Constitution, is to be the chief negotiator with other countries. And of course, that job is delegated to some degree to the Secretary of State, and even to a lesser degree to other agencies within the executive branch, with the idea that the president is always the chief executive officer and has the ultimate executive authority granted by the Constitution and empowered through the election process. When the president is elected and sworn into office, there you go. That's the executive power. And since the beginning, since George Washington, the president has used that power to negotiate with countries, friends and foe, to either get our friends to be better friends or to punish our enemies or to block our foes. It's a tool. And then a big part of the tool is this process of putting tariffs on international trade as sort of the carrot and the stick method of convincing our friends and foes alike that we would prefer that they do something in our interests rather than their interests. That's the whole executive process dealing with foreign issues. It's been going on since, well, 1789 when the Constitution happened. And of course, if you've studied the American Revolution, you know that Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, others were zipping back and forth between the colonies and Paris. Notice I didn't say Washington, D.C. The colonies and Paris, and trying to, shore up support for the revolution from the French and trying to calm things down with the British. That's the typical give and take of states personship, and that's what the State Department does, and that's of course what the president does. So when President Trump was elected, he was using these tariffs as a tool to cajole our friends and foes to be more receptive to American interests. And of course, there were lawsuits that were filed to challenge the scope of the president's power. And of course, the Supreme Court came out today in a 6-3 ruling. And if you read the headlines, and remember, this is the Eastman Financial Report, and what we do here is we dissect the headlines. So you don't just see the silver minnow swimming across, you see the filament line attached to the front of the minnow as well. So we want to think about what does this opinion mean? Now, to be fair, it's 136 pages long, and it has been delayed. We had expected this opinion a few weeks ago. So I have not yet read the opinion. I'm reading summaries and bullet points from various legal sources, but I'm gaining an impression as to what happened. And what the United States Supreme Court said is that under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that's IEEPA. There's an act passed by Congress, signed by the president in 1977, who I think was Jimmy Carter. Can't remember. Yeah, I think it was. But the point is, it's the law of the land, and that is what the President Trump was using for about half of the tariffs that have been put in place. And there's been some very, very positive success with respect to using tariffs to better position American commerce and exports in the global economy. So it was a successful program. But there were people, of course, anyone whose ox is gored, as we used to say, will file a lawsuit, and the issue at the court, and this is important, whenever you read Supreme Court decisions, they're usually long and quite complicated, and if you're not a lawyer, then they become a little bit hard to understand sometimes, which is a problem, because in my opinion, if you live in a democracy or a free society, you should not have a special class of priests like lawyers who are the only people who can interpret the law. The average person of average reading skills should be able to read a statute and a case and understand what the law is. Well, that's sometimes not the case. And it's sometimes not the case in more complex litigation, like international trade litigation, as you can imagine, is very complex. So the plaintiffs in the case, the plaintiffs are the people who bring the lawsuit, and the defendant, of course, is President Trump. He has to defend himself. The plaintiffs argued that the IEEPA, the 1977 Act, did not grant the president the power to create a new tax. And as a result of the way these tariffs have been implemented, and this is a 6-3 decision, the court felt that President Trump was creating a new tax, and he didn't have that power under the act. So they have negated the tariffs that are promulgated under the act that are like taxes. Okay, not all, but the ones that are like taxes, they have been overturned. Other tariffs in place, the other half of the tariffs that President Trump has been using, are still in place because they either fall under a different provision of the IEEPA or they fall under different acts that have been promulgated at least since the 1930s. But if you look at even early congressional actions in the 1700s through the 1800s, Congress has always enacted tariffs because tariffs are a tax. And in the 50 years that the IEEPA has been in place, it has not been used by a president as a taxation form. So the court clarified the powers of the president and solidified the power of the Congress, where Congress enacts taxes. That's what they do. The president doesn't do that. That's where the purse strings of the government is the House of Representatives, and the House with the Senate will enact taxes to support the spending that they promulgate, that becomes law. And wouldn't it be a lovely thing if we had a balanced budget act where they could only raise as much in revenues as they are going to spend, or they can only spend as much as they raise? But we don't have that. It's an open window, and that's the $38.5 trillion in debt and the $2.5 trillion in annual deficit. But the point is, the court has limited the power of the president to not use that particular act to create a tax. And there were 3 dissents. They were conservative justices that dissented. And one of the interesting dissents had to do with the fact that the court has now overturned tariffs, but money has been collected into the United States Treasury. And of course, we would expect to see lawsuits being filed left and right, demanding a refund of a tariff, which was a tax that was found to not be in compliance with that law, the IEEPA. So there'll be lots of lawsuits. Everybody wants their money back, of course. Now, this is a real problem for the federal government of the United States because we're already broke. See, we have this $38.5 trillion in debt piled up, and we're running a deficit of $2 to $2.5 trillion again this year, with deficits as far as the eye can see. As a matter of fact, yesterday I talked about the 3% cap on deficits, where we'll only allow the deficits to go up by 3%. We won't be thinking about eliminating deficits, balancing a budget, or even running a surplus to pay off some of the debt. No, we're just going to, just like the debt ceiling. We pass a debt ceiling so everybody thinks we're doing something, but the reality is the 3% is very much like the debt ceiling, and the first time an emergency comes along, well, it'll be swept away. So the point is, the Supreme Court has sort of trimmed the sails of President Trump's yacht or a sailboat or a skiff. And at the end of the day, nobody's quite sure what it means. But rest assured that the president still has amazing powers with respect to international negotiations and international trade. So President Trump this morning was talking about he has a plan B. And of course, I would assume the president always has a plan B because he's a very wise businessman. But there are other acts that will be available to achieve the same outcome. So while it's a big headline, and again, that's the silver minnow with the filament string attached to the nose, the reality is it's more complicated, and it's much more complicated than you'll read in the headlines. To give an example, in 1974, there was the Trade Act passed by Congress that gave the president this very power that he executed under the IEEPA, but it limited it to only 150 days, and it capped the tariff at only 15%. Well, if you're a foreign country, you can wait out the 150 days and basically thumb your nose and say, well, the clock's running and we're not doing it. But it's there and it's available, and it still has economic impact. If for 150 days you're going to slap a 15% tariff on something coming from some foreign country like Canada or somebody who's technically close to us, that will have an economic impact, and it will be a leverage point in any negotiation. So that is a tool that still exists. Within the IEEPA, there's Section 301, which is greater than 15%, and it's an indefinite period of time with no expiration date. So if it doesn't expire, it's greater than 15%, you can merely drop down to Section 301 and use that instead of the sections that were found to not create a tax. There's also Section 232, which is a national security tariff. If the president determines that there's a national security issue, then he or she can put this tax on, this tariff on, and that's fine because that's built into the legislation. And then, of course, there's the nuclear option, as it's been called, the Tariff Act of 1930, Smoot-Hawley Act, and of course that act has taken a lot of political criticism over the last year because if you go back into the origins of the Great Depression, and I am more and more convinced the Great Depression was very much a creation of media. It was slow economic times, but the more research you do into the public communication by the federal government to the American people, the more you realize that it was an overblown message designed to create fear, designed to allow the federal government to adopt all sorts of independent agencies, Federal Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission. All of these commissions appeared in the 1930s to try and stave the Great Depression and turn the economy around and make life beautiful again. But it was a massive expansion of power within Washington, and it created the regulatory class that was theoretically outside of the purview of the president, because these independent agencies, and they do wonderful work. I worked at the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, as a student, and let me tell you, that is probably one of the finest federal agencies in existence, because their job is to keep the bad guys away from your savings, and they do a very good job of policing Wall Street, which is the stocks and bonds and all of the investment vehicles. And if without regulation, that would be an absolute Wild West. So, we look at the administrative state, and the administrative state emerged in the 1930s due to a great part by the hysteria created by the media, the American the government-sponsored media that effectively created the Great Depression in the minds of people, that allowed for the emergence of the administrative state in which we live today. But the point is, the 1930 Act, the Tariff Act, was blamed for creating the Great Depression because we slapped all these tariffs on everybody, and then they slapped tariffs back, and before you know it, international trade collapsed, and they blamed the Great Depression and the crash of '29 on the Tariff Act of 1930. Well, it's still on the books, and the president has amazing power underneath the Tariff Act, Section 338, and President Trump has the ability to use that with a great deal of restraint, but yet he certainly has the power to replace the IEEPA tariffs with other tariffs and achieve the same social and economic goals. I have to take a break here. Let's take a break. I'll be right back. We'll talk about some other news. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now, and we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview.
Okay, so I'm back. So the point of the tariff story is this: as you see the silver minnow swimming by, you want to ask yourself the question, what is the filament untied to the nose of the minnow? Okay, and the summary is that the Supreme Court has taken away, has effectively defined the presidential power to not include tariffs under the IEEPA, but the president has other options, and of course, this will motivate the president to use these other options because this president is a fighter, and this is a president who will get the job done. And it's good that the court clarifies that particular act, what are the boundaries and limits. So the court has done a good thing to define and clarify federal law, but it certainly will not stop the process. And that's why when you hear the headline screaming that the court shot down the president of the United States tariffs, um, well, there's more to that story. There's a lot more than a silver minnow. And that's why you want to understand that the president has a lot of powers under different acts to achieve essentially the same goal using a different tool. And he will. And that's the whole sum and substance of this big story today about how the Supreme Court has reeled in Donald Trump. Well, I don't think he has. But it is good to clarify federal law. That's very important that we live in a land and a nation of laws. The laws are supreme, and we will follow the laws. And this helps to clarify who has which powers and how they are used, which creates clarity in marketplaces. And markets like clearness; they don't like confusion. So this is something that this will be respected. Well, let's move on to other news. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, of course, we're getting conflicting information on the housing numbers. If you remember earlier in the week, the pending home sales cratered. They were going down. And of course, that was a big news story that the economy is crashing, sky's falling. But we want to ask the question, what are pending home sales? Because oftentimes we see blurbs of economic information that are, again, a headline, and they suggest something that isn't happening. And of course, the pending home sales, if you've ever purchased a home, and many people have, you know that it's a process. You will find, and let's just talk about existing homes, okay? There'll be a home with a for sale sign on the lawn and a realtor smiling in the front door. You go in, you like the place, you write an offer to purchase, the offer is accepted. Now you have a sales agreement. Contingencies happen, like you have to get your financing in place, and then there's an inspection, and you check the zoning and whatever contingencies you put in. All the contingencies are met, and then there's a day of closing, and that's when the sellers show up with the money and the buyers. No, I'm sorry. The buyers show up with the money and the sellers show up with the title. The title changes hands, and that's the closing. And now the buyers own a new home and the sellers have sold their old home. And that's the process. Well, that pending is that window. From the day you sign the first piece of paper, and in some states will call it an offer to purchase, some will call it a sales contract, whatever it is, it's effectively it's a meeting of the mind, a bargain for exchange. It's a contract between a buyer and a seller where they agree to buy and sell a home. And once that is signed, it takes time to get through the contingencies and the financing and all the stuff to get to the day of closing. And then once it closes, the deal's done. So it's that pending home sale window we're watching. And you can imagine that sometimes homes, maybe the inspection comes back and somebody wants something fixed, or they don't want it fixed, or they want some money off, or whatever. It takes longer than anticipated, and oftentimes real estate sales contracts are extended by mutual agreement of the parties. They'll extend the closing date, or they'll extend the time of a contingency like an inspection because the inspector is busy, you can't get there in time, whatever. That's all normal stuff. And it's a very fluid thing. And that when homes go under contract and you get to the closing, that's what we're measuring with pending sales. And you can imagine the internal variables in that calculation are rather significant, because some people will test the water, others will test the sewer system, others will test the insulation, somebody will test for mold issues, maybe somebody will check to make sure the roof isn't leaking. And all of this stuff takes time. So using the pending home sales as a metric to project macroeconomic data is risky because it's not clear data. It's not a defined unit. Like if it took 30 days for every home to go under contract to the date of closing, and every contract was 30 days, like a futures contract, then that would be a predictive number that would be helpful in economic and financial analysis, but it's not. So when you see that pending home number going, oh, it's down, it's terrible. Well, it goes up, it goes down. One thing we know about real estate statistics is it goes up and down a lot. There's a lot of delta, a lot of change happens because of the timing issue. From the time you take a raw piece of land and subdivide it and put in the utilities and the streets, and sidewalks, curb and gutter, whatever you're putting in, street lights, build the house, sell the house, close on the house, that takes a long time. And it can be weather driven. You have a very wet spring or a terrible winter, or maybe it's a dusty, dry summer, it's too hot to work. All of that, all of those variables factor in. So you have to be careful about the pending home sales numbers going down, because those who want the economy to look bad will say, look, the pending home sales are down, the economy is falling apart, it's time for a change. And of course, the people who are, who understand that, you just realize there's a lot of politics in economic numbers, and that's why we talk about economics as being the dismal science, and it is. I mean, that's just classically everyone who has a graduate degree in economics chuckles because it is quite dismal. If you can't sleep at night, study micro 301 or something. It puts you to sleep. But the point is, when we look at economic numbers, you have to understand what you're seeing, and you can't jump to political conclusions. Because earlier this week we talked about new units were up, and they were up rather dramatically. And since 2021, last year's units, there were 745,000 new homes that were built and sold in the United States. Now, that's just relatively speaking, when you look at historical data, that's a relatively small number. I mean, we would tend to look at 2 million to 4 million homes either built or sold in general. We looked yesterday. I was talking about it was a little over 4 million homes sold, new and existing homes last year alone. So we don't see a collapse of the housing market. What you're seeing is data that's time sensitive and time driven. And why that matters is because I mention often that I've taken up with people on X who are economic experts. I guess a room full of economists. If you get three economists, you'll get five opinions. But the point is, it's a robust debate, and there's a certain faction that it's really kind of an interesting perspective. They have the idea that as the baby boomer generation dies off, that there's going to be this glut of housing that floods the market, and housing prices are going to crash. And then, of course, they'll be able to step in and buy a house, because I'm thinking that this is sort of like, oh, I'm a little there, I mean, I will skip that example, but there are times in history where people who are desperate to believe that things are coming back the way they were in the old days will become like mesmerized with this idea. And I guess there's a famous example of the Sioux Nation, the Indian tribe, the Sioux Nation, the ghost dancer phenomenon that happened toward the end of the 1800s, when it was quite clear that Europe was flooding across the fruited plains. There became a mysticism that if you dance around the fire hard enough and long enough in a trance, that they'll all go home. And it was sort of a last ditch idea that you could bring back what was, but will never be again. And I don't like using ethnic, because the ghost, the Sioux people are very important to my family, and but the point is this, the housing market is not going to collapse as baby boomers die, because baby boomers don't just die en masse and the homes escheat to the state. They don't yield back to the state. There's always heirs. And trust me, when you look at the progression of life and the path of life, as people get older, if they have children or nieces or nephews or any relative at all, they will be very eager to take that house and sell it at the market. They're not going to sell it at a bargain price because, grandpa or grandma is in the nursing home. They don't do that. Nobody does that. It's not economically rational. And then when you factor in the pent up demand for single family housing, not only by the private equity people, and President Trump has addressed that issue, private equity is a major driver of the price of homes because it adds to aggregate demand. It's not just the traditional home buying family unit or whatever, home buyers, American home buyers. It is that plus private equity, which is infinite. And then you add foreign buyers because many, many foreign people have the right to come here and buy a house. You can do that. You may not be able to vote here, but you can certainly own a home. So the aggregate demand that they're looking at is it's a traditional little sector, but it's small compared to private equity and foreign buyers as well as domestic. So this idea that, in 20 years when all the boomers are dead, housing is going to be really cheap again, it's just simply not. And then when you factor in inflation, and inflation drives interest rates, you're not going to see anything other than an ascending market. And I go back and forth with these, these are fine minds, they're very, very intelligent people, but we have a disagreement. And I said, you're waiting for a phenomenon that will not happen. You can dance around the campfire all night long for weeks and weeks on end, and they're not going back to Europe. They're here, okay? They're not changing that phenomenon because this is housing. This is what housing is. And if you look back, if you point back to the 1930s, the 1940s, when World War II ended and the soldiers came back and the GI plan funded, I think they were called 225 housing, Section 225 housing. It was a little three-bedroom ranch, single story, a little Cape Cod style. And they were selling these brand new in these new suburbs and subdivisions that were emerging, the Levittown phenomenon that spread across the country for $8,000. And you could have bought a brand new home on the GI Bill for $8,000. Now, $8,000 is a lot of money in those days, but that's what that house cost. Well, those houses today still stand in nice neighborhoods, and they're $500,000, $600,000. They're one of the 80-year-old houses. They're used, but they're not used up, and they still have market value. So, you're not going to go back to seeing prices of the 1940s under the GI Bill. You can buy a house for $8,000. You can't do it. It just simply is not possible because if you look at the aggregate of the cost of all the building and that, you just simply aren't going to see housing crash because baby boomers are dying off. Anyway, I'm out of time for today. It's been a great week. I'll talk about the water issue with data centers on Monday. And don't forget to go to worldviewfoundation.com, make a donation. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you Monday. Bye.